Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're going to tackle something pretty central in deep learning for visual stuff, this whole idea of long-tailed learning.
Right. And it sounds maybe a bit academic, but it's a really, really common practical problem.
Yeah, definitely not about actual long tails on animals. It's about how data is often skewed. Like, imagine you're teaching a computer to spot birds.
Okay.
You probably have thousands, maybe millions of pictures of, say, robins or sparrows, right? That's the big head of your data.
The really common species.
Exactly. But then for some rare bird, maybe a specific warbler, you might only have a handful of photos. That's the long tail.
And that imbalance, well, it really throws a wrench into how these deep learning models learn.
How so? What actually happens?
They tend to get really, really good at recognizing the things they see all the time, those head classes. Makes sense, right?
Lots of practice.
But they often perform pretty poorly on the things in the tail, the less frequent classes.
So they become specialists in the common stuff and kind of ignore the rare stuff.
Pretty much. You can even visualize it. In the feature space where the model organizes what it learns, the boundaries it draws between classes get pulled away from the tail classes.
Pulled because the head classes have so much data, like gravity.
Exactly. That sheer volume just exerts a stronger influence during the training process.
Okay, let's ground this a bit. Where does this actually bite us in the real world?
Oh, it's everywhere once you start looking. Think about face recognition.
All right.
Massive amounts of data for celebrities, public figures, maybe people who opt in online. But for the average person, much, much less.
Right.
Or species classification, like the iNaturalist project. Tons of data on common plants and animals.
But endangered species.
Very few examples. Same thing in medical imaging. Lots of scans showing common conditions. Fewer for rare diseases.
That seems critical.
It is. Or understanding street scenes for autonomous driving, or drone imagery looking for specific, maybe uncommon objects or anomalies. It's a really fundamental challenge.
So the mission for us today is really to unpack how the research community is trying to fix this. We're basing this on a big survey paper that maps out all the different approaches people are taking for deep long-tailed learning.
Yeah, it's a great overview.
And our goal is to sort of understand the main strategies, right? How to build visual recognition systems that are fairer, more balanced across the board.
Exactly. Not just good at the top few categories.
So where do we start? How does the survey categorize these solutions?
Okay, so the survey groups them quite neatly into three main technical areas. The first big one is class rebalancing.
Rebalancing. That sounds intuitive, trying to make things more even during training.
That's the core idea.
Yeah.
Directly tackling that uneven influence from different class sizes. And within rebalancing, there are kind of three main flavors. First up is resampling.
Yeah, resampling.
Yeah.
So literally changing which data points the model sees and how often.
Yep. The classic ways were things like oversampling, just duplicating the data from the rare classes. Or undersampling, throwing away some data from the common classes.
Seems simple enough. Do they work well for deep learning?
Well, they have downsides. Just duplicating rare examples doesn't add new information, and the model might just overfit, basically memorize those few samples.
Right, doesn't generalize well.
And undersampling, well, you might be throwing away useful information from those head classes. You still need to learn them properly.
Okay, so what are the smarter ways people are doing resampling now?
There are more sophisticated, deep learning specific techniques. Things like class balance sampling.
How's that work?
The idea is simple. In each batch of data the model sees during training, you make sure there's an equal chance of picking any class, regardless of how rare it is overall.
Ah, so you force it to pay attention to the rare ones more often.
Exactly. It stops the training updates being totally dominated by the head classes. Then there's square root sampling, which is a bit gentler, still boosts the tail, but not quite as aggressively. Some methods get even fancier, like progressively balanced sampling, where you start closer to the original imbalance and slowly shift towards more balance as training goes on.
Like a curriculum.
Yeah, and dynamic curriculum learning, DCL, explicitly does that, adjusting based on how well the model is doing. Others use meta-learning or model performance itself to guide the sampling, like LOCE or balanced meta-softmax.
Oh, lots of variations.
And even things like SimCal's bi-level sampling for tasks where you have imbalance at multiple levels, like detecting rare objects within generally rare scene types.
Okay, that's a deep dive just on resampling. What's the next approach under rebalancing?
The second subcategory is class-sensitive learning.
Okay, so not changing the data samples themselves, but changing how the model learns from them.
Precisely. You modify the loss function, the thing that tells the model how wrong its predictions are. The goal is to make errors on the tail classes count for more.
Like putting a higher penalty on mistakes for rare examples.
Exactly. Two main ways to do that. One is reweighting. You assign different weights to the loss calculated for each class.
So a higher weight for tail class losses.
Generally, yes. Methods like weighted softmax or class balance loss try to estimate an effective number of samples per class and adjust weights based on that. Balance softmax tweaks the prediction scores before the loss calculation based on class frequencies.
Interesting.
And then you have things like focal loss, which is quite clever. It downweights the loss for examples the model already finds easy.
So it focuses effort on the hard ones.
Which often include those tail class examples. Some methods like MetaWeightNet even try to learn the best weights automatically from data. There's also equalization loss, ACSL, seesaw loss. Lots of variations on this theme.
Okay, reweighting the loss. What's the other way within class-sensitive learning?
The other is remargining.
Yeah.
This is about adjusting the decision boundaries again, but through the loss function, by adding class-specific margin requirements. Think of it as pushing the boundary further away for certain classes, creating a bigger buffer zone.
To make the model more confident about the tail classes.
That's the idea. Make it harder for the model to confuse them. LDAM is a well-known one. It enforces larger margins for tail classes. Others like UML or LOCE make these margins adaptive, changing during training based on model uncertainty.
Does that ever hurt performance on the head classes?
It can, yeah. So some methods like ROBLE actually enforce larger margins for head classes too, trying to balance things out.
Okay, intriguing. So we've got resampling the data, adjusting the loss.
Yeah.
What's the third part of class rebalancing?
The final one is logit adjustment. This happens right at the end after the model has made its initial predictions.
Lodges, those are the raw scores before they become probabilities. Right?
Exactly. So you take a model that might already be biased from training on imbalanced data, and you adjust those final scores to compensate.
A post-processing step, almost.
Kind of, yeah. A common way is just to boost the scores for classes, were rare in the training data. Give them a little bump.
Seems straightforward.
It can be. More advanced methods like ROBLE again or disaligned try to learn these adjustments adaptively, sometimes even without needing to know the exact frequencies beforehand.
Right, so that covers the whole class rebalancing angle. What's the second major category of solutions in the survey?
The second big bucket is information augmentation.
Augmentation.
Yeah.
Like adding more useful stuff.
Exactly. Introducing additional information to help the model, especially for those data-starved tail classes. This mainly splits into transfer learning and data augmentation.
Okay, transfer learning. That's about borrowing knowledge from somewhere else, right? Like a bigger, more general data set.
Precisely. A very common strategy is just model pre-training. Train a model on something huge like the standard ImageNet, get good general features, and then fine-tune it on your specific long-tailed task. DSTL, SSP, use this.
Standard practice, almost.
Pretty much. Then there's knowledge distillation. You train a teacher model, maybe using some fancy rebalancing, make it really good.
Okay.
And then use its predictions to teach a student model on the original long-tailed data. LFME, RIDE, DIE, SSD do variations of this.
So the student learns from the teacher's wisdom on the imbalanced data.
Yeah, that's the idea. You can also try head-to-tail model transfer, trying to explicitly move knowledge learned from the data-rich head classes over to help the tail classes. MetaModelNet and GIST explore this.
That sounds tricky.
It can be. And finally, there's self-training. Use the model's own confident predictions on unlabeled data to create more training examples, pseudo-labels.
Expanding the data set itself.
Right, but you have to be careful with long-tailed data. Methods like DARS and CREST look into how to do that effectively.
Okay, so various ways to transfer knowledge. What about the other part? Data augmentation. That's more about fiddling with the existing data.
Yeah, making the most of what you do have, especially for the tail classes. Standard augmentations like flips, rotations, crops help, but we can do more.
Like what?
There's transfer-based augmentation. Here, you try to use knowledge from head classes to guide how you augment the tail classes, maybe transferring styles or features. Emptometer, FTL, RSG, OAHE are examples.
So making the tail data look more varied, inspired by the head data.
Something like that. Or generating new tail features based on head features. Then there's non-transfer augmentation. This involves adapting existing techniques like, say, SMOD, which creates synthetic minority samples, or using mix-up strategies like Miscelas and Remix, where you blend samples and labels in clever ways suited for long-tailed distributions. FAFSA and Metasog even try to learn the best augmentation policies.
Okay, that makes sense. Enhancing the data you have. So we've covered rebalancing and information augmentation. What's the third big pillar?
The third major category is module improvement.
Module improvement. So tinkering with the actual building blocks of the neural network itself.
Exactly. Making specific parts of the architecture better suited to handle long-tailed data. This breaks down into improving representation learning, refining the classifier design, using decoupled training, and leveraging ensemble learning.
Okay, let's start with representation learning. That's about the features the model extracts from the images.
Right. The goal is to learn features that are really discriminative, even for classes with very few examples, making sure they're well separated in that internal map we talked about.
How do you achieve that?
Several ways. Metric learning focuses on the distance function used to compare features, trying to pull similar examples together and push different ones apart, even rare ones. Think LMLE, range loss, CRO, KCL. Then there's prototype learning, where you try to learn a single representative feature vector or prototype for each class. OLTR and IEM are examples. The model then classifies based on proximity to these prototypes.
Right.
And some methods use sequential training, like HFL or unequal training, where they might train the feature extractor in stages, perhaps focusing more on tail classes later on.
Interesting. And what about classifier design? That's the final decision-making layer.
Yeah, the part that takes the learned features and makes the actual prediction. Standard classifiers, like the softmax layer, can get really biased by the head classes.
So what are the alternatives?
People have explored things like cosine classifiers or normalized classifiers. They basically normalize the feature vectors and the classifier weights.
Why does normalization help?
It makes the classification less sensitive to the magnitude of the features or weights, which can sometimes be misleadingly large for frequent classes just due to more training updates. There's also the nearest class mean classifier, simple idea, just assign a sample to the class whose average feature vector is closest.
Yeah.
And then more complex designs are emerging, like classifiers that incorporate known relationships between classes, realistic taxonomic classifier, or ones that try to model and remove the bias caused by the imbalance itself, like a causal classifier.
Right. Now, decoupled training sounded interesting when you mentioned it, separating things out.
Yeah, this has become quite influential. The idea is to split training into two stages.
Stage one.
Train the feature extractor, the main body of the network. And here's the kicker. You often just train it with standard random sampling, seeing data according to its natural imbalanced frequency.
Really? Wouldn't that learn biased features?
You'd think so, but the finding, highlighted in a key paper called Decoupling, was that this stage often learns surprisingly good general-purpose features anyway.
Huh. Okay, so what's stage two?
Freeze those features, stop the feature extractor from changing, and then train just the classifier layer on top.
And now you use the balancing tricks.
Exactly. In stage two, you apply your class rebalancing, maybe class balance sampling or special loss function, focusing all the imbalance correction effort just on the classifier, KCL, miscellaneous, OFA, disalign. Lots of recent methods build on this decoupled idea.
That's a neat separation of concerns. And the last module improvement strategy, ensemble learning.
Right. Combining multiple models or model components, we know this often helps performance generally.
How does it help specifically for long tails?
The idea is often to create experts that are good at different things. For example, bilateral branch networks like BBN or SimCal might have two parallel network branches trained differently. Maybe one sees balanced data, one sees imbalanced, then you combine their knowledge.
Complementary expert.
Yeah, or multi-head schemes like BagSwat might group classes, maybe head, middle, tail, and train separate classifier heads for each group.
Specializing.
Other approaches train experts on different subsets of classes, ACE, rest of day, or train multiple diverse experts on all the data, hoping they learn different strategies. Rhaptactic. A really advanced approach like SETE even trains diverse experts and learns how to best combine them at test time, adapting to potentially different test distributions.
Wow, okay. That's a huge range of techniques across rebalancing, augmentation, and module improvements. Now, how do we know if they're actually working well on the imbalance problem specifically? The survey mentioned a new metric.
Yes, they propose something called relative accuracy.
Then why not just use standard accuracy?
Well, standard accuracy can go up for lots of reasons. Maybe you used a better underlying network architecture or just more data overall. Those things might improve accuracy on all classes, not necessarily because the method is better at the long tail aspect.
Ah, okay. So relative accuracy tries to isolate the improvement due to tackling the imbalance itself.
Exactly. It compares the accuracy you get on the long-tailed dataset to a reference accuracy, usually from training the same base model on a balanced version of the dataset. It asks, how much of the gap caused by imbalance did this method close?
That makes sense. So what did they find when they applied this metric to benchmarks like ImageNet LT or iNaturalist?
Well, the good news is that most of these specialized long-tailed methods do show significant improvements in relative accuracy compared to just standard training. They are genuinely helping with the imbalance.
Well, there's always a but.
Often, yeah. A common finding is a trade-off. Many methods improve accuracy on the tail and middle classes, which is great, but sometimes at the cost of slightly lower accuracy on the head classes.
Interesting. So it's hard to lift all boats equally.
It seems to be, for many approaches. They also noted that ensemble methods, like Seiride and Ride we mentioned, currently seem to achieve the best overall relative accuracy, suggesting combining diverse strategies is powerful.
Any other key empirical takeaways?
A couple of interesting points. Within class rebalancing, just throwing resampling, reweighting, and logit adjustment together doesn't necessarily work. You need careful design. They can sometimes interfere with each other.
Okay.
On the other hand, information augmentation techniques, transfer learning, data augmentation seem pretty complementary. You can often add them on top of other methods and potentially get improvements across the board for head, middle, and tail classes.
That's good to know.
And finally, they observed that class rebalancing methods and the decoupled training strategy often seem to play similar roles. They provide somewhat interchangeable ways to address the core imbalance problem, particularly at the classifier level.
Those are really useful insights. Did this survey also point towards what's next? Future research directions.
Absolutely. They laid out quite a few exciting avenues. One big one is test-agnostic long-tailed learning, meaning how do you train a model that works well even if the class distribution you see during testing is different and maybe unknown compared to your training data? Very realistic problem.
Definitely. What else?
Open set long-tailed learning. So dealing with imbalance, but also being able to identify when a test sample belongs to a completely new class you've never seen before.
Super important for real-world deployment.
Totally. Then there's federated long-tailed learning, how to do this, when data is decentralized across many devices, like phones, each with its own potentially skewed data.
Right. Privacy and distribution challenges.
Class incremental long-tailed learning, learning new, potentially rare classes over time without forgetting the old ones. Multi-domain long-tailed learning, handling imbalance and shifts in data domains simultaneously. Robust long-tailed learning, dealing with noisy labels or corrupted data within these imbalanced data sets.
It seems the complexity just keeps layering up.
It does. And they even point beyond classification to things like long-tailed regression, where your output is a continuous value, but the distribution of those values is skewed, and long-tailed video learning, bringing these challenges into the time dimension.
It's really clear that this is a rich and ongoing area of research. So if we boil it down, what are the main things you want people to take away from this deep dive?
I think the first is just recognizing how widespread this long-tailed challenge is. It's not some niche corner case. It affects many, many important visual recognition tasks.
Yeah.
Second, there's a really diverse toolkit emerging. We've talked about rebalancing, augmentation, module improvements. Researchers are attacking this from multiple angles. Understanding these strategies is becoming crucial if you want to build AI systems that are actually fair and reliable in practice.
Because real-world data is messy and imbalanced.
Exactly. And while huge progress has been made, especially in boosting those tail classes,
There's still work to do.
yeah, that trade-off with head classes highlights a key challenge. The ongoing goal is really to find methods that lift performance everywhere across all classes, especially as we move towards even more complex, dynamic, real-world scenarios.
It really underscores how tightly linked the data we feed these systems is to their final behavior, their capabilities, and, frankly, their potential biases. A really important thing to keep in mind.
Couldn't agree more. And, for anyone whose interest is really piqued by the specifics, the survey paper itself, Deep Long-Tailed Learning Surveys, definitely the place to go for all the technical details and references to the individual methods we touched on.
Excellent. Well, thanks for walking us through that complex landscape, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.